Hi, we are here working on problem 4.29 from page 191 and 192, so it crosses 2 pages. You may want to go ahead and get your book out because for a lot of the problem I probably won't have the book in front of us, I'll just be working it. So in this problem we're going to really get down to consider activity-based drivers and how we use activity-based drivers, or really a series of activity drivers and their rates to figure out overhead, right? So in this example, we've got a company that makes 2 different exercise bikes, a standard and a deluxe, and of course it's different quantities that they're going to produce at different prices, different costs, different amounts of hours. And over on the next page it talks about, more of the activities and how much is spent on overhead, and here's our total overhead. So the goal of the problem overall is to discuss a couple different ways, just regular plant-wide rate or using activity base to distribute this $4.5 million in total overhead. Now, in real life you'd have to figure out your drivers, but in this particular problem they've gone through and they've got direct labor hours, engineering support, receiving orders, materials handling, purchasing, maintenance, paying suppliers, setting up batches. So all the different activities that might be going on in creating these exercise bikes, and those can be our drivers. So somebody's figured that out, and they figured out how much we spent doing those activities. So it's going to be pretty easy to calculate the drivers. It's just, that there's a lot of them, and quite frankly, that's one of the drawbacks to activity-based costing, is it's time-consuming. All right, so let's go back to this problem. So the first part of the problem asks us to simply take our overhead and calculate the cost per unit for all of it. So we're just going to assume that we're using direct labor and just calculate a plant-wide rate and figure out unit costs for standard and deluxe based on that plant-wide rate. So here's our total overhead that we're trying to allocate, $4.5 million. And we'll probably need some of these numbers over here, right? Our prime costs, meaning our direct materials and our direct labors for each model. So we'll need that to figure out our total product cost, unit per unit. And we'll go ahead and do that. So we got to figure out our overhead rate first. So this is problem 429, page 191. There's a problem like it that starts talking about activity-based costing, 153 through 154. So we'll just move right on into that. All right. So for first part, though, we're not really doing activity-based costing. We're just going to figure out a plant-wide rate. Okay. So we know the overhead we need to consider is $4,500,000, and I know that because in the book on page 192, that the last part of the problem just adds up all the overhead activity costs, $4,500,000. All right, and the problem says figure out your plant-wide rate using labor hours. All right, so we take our overhead, divide it by labor hours, and I'll have to figure out the labor hours. And here you go, direct labor hours for standard model, 75. Direct labor hours for deluxe is 75. So 75,000 plus 75,000 is 150,000 direct labor hours. All right, so 4,500,000 divided by 150,000 equals $30 per direct labor hour. All right, so that's our overhead rate if we're going to do plant-wide assignment of overhead. All right, so whether it's a deluxe, whether it's a standard, you just go how many labor hours times 30, and that's your overhead rate. And the question says to figure out the per unit cost, so we have to add in our materials and our direct labor too. So our direct stuff, or what we call prime costs, and then our overhead. So let's go ahead and do this, figure out our unit cost. So we're going to need to do for standard and deluxe, right, because we got 2 product lines. We're going to have to take our prime costs. That's just what they tell us in the book. So if you look at the problem, it doesn't break out direct labor and direct materials, it just says prime costs. If it is, you would just take your direct labor plus direct materials plus overhead is your unit cost. But here we got 4.5 million and 5.25 million. All right, so I'm going to come down here and kind of do some calculations. All right, so our prime cost for a standard is going to be 4,500,000 divided by how many units? 30,000. The standard model, we're going to make 30,000 units. So that means our prime cost per unit for a standard is $150 per unit. All right, so remember, this is by the unit. This is unit costs. All right. Standard is 150. So I make 1 unit, my prime costs are 150. And for a deluxe, the book says we have got 5.25 million, 5,250,000 divided by how many units? It says 15,000. Right? So 5,250,000 divided by 15,000 is 350. So prime costs for the deluxe is 350. All right. So now we take our prime cost plus our overhead. For standard, it is, for both of them, it's $30. And how many labor hours go into a standard's 75,000. So we need to figure out the rate. So that is equal to 30 times 75,000 divided by 30,000 units, right? $30 per hour times how many hours we spend, but divided by the units. So that ends up being $75 per unit of overhead for standard. And for deluxe, that is of course still our 30 times the number of units we're going to make, the number of hours which we're going to spend, which is also 7. It's just coincidence. Well, it might not be coincidence. You know, it might be that it just costs the same to put the same amount of hours put together, divided by 15,000 units. So it took the same number of hours, but yet fewer units. So we're going to come up with a rate of 150 for deluxe. So if you add them up, the unit cost for a standard is $225, and for a deluxe is $500. So all we did was apply a plant-wide rate of $30 an hour, turn these things into unit costs. There you go. If you create one standard bike, it's going to cost $225. You create one deluxe bike, it's going to cost $500. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go on to part 2, and we're going to calculate activity rates. We're not going to calculate the whole unit cost yet, but we need to get our activity rate. So our prime cost is going to stay the same, right? Direct materials, direct labor. But we want to re-estimate our overhead based on activity-based drivers. And in order to do that, we need to get all those driver rates. So this was our rate plant-wide, all right, per unit. But we're going to change that a little bit because we're going to use all those different activities. See you on the next video.